6. Okay, we will call the Chino City Council and the successor agency to the redevelopment agency to order. The date is October 8th, and this is the study section. Please note that all council members are present, and Councilman Burton will lead us in the flag salute, so please stand.
Ready to begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone in the agenda, my goodness, in the audience that would like to address the council on an item that is not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to discussion items. Item number 1, 2021-29 Housing Element Update and Zone Ordinance Amendment. This item is to discuss regarding the proposed amendments to the 21-29 Housing Element and Zoning Ordinance Amendment related to the overlay districts for affordable housing. Our staff report this evening will be provided by our principal planner, Mr. Mike Hitz, and Nick Chen from Kimberly Corn. Now, our city attorney, Fred Galante, is running a little bit behind, so he will join us shortly. Gentlemen?
Good evening, Mayor, council members. So thanks for getting back together with us on this. So tonight, we kind of have a little short agenda here. We're going to kind of get into a little bit of the housing element background. Nick's going to help us kind of go through the proposed revisions of the housing element and zoning and kind of some of the outcomes of our meetings with the HCD. And then when Fred gets here, we're going to have him kind of go through the potential impacts of not having a compliant housing element. So just kind of a quick little history, just to kind of get everybody up to speed. So back in 2019, the city began going through the regional housing needs allocation process with SCAG to work with them to help determine what the city's allocation for the number of units that we would be required to be identified in our housing element during this current sixth cycle of the housing element from 2021 to 2029. Back in late 2019 and early 2020, we really thought about, I didn't have as much gray in my beard back then, but really thought about ahead of time of getting with the consultants because we knew all the cities were going to get what we call kind of the big numbers. So we worked with Kimberly Horn and got them on board to start drafting our housing element. So we went through a lot of various meetings and throughout that year, 2019, during the pandemic, which was, I think we did a pretty good job of getting through it. In early 2021, after various outreach and workshops and with the city council, we did the first adoption of the housing element. And a part of that was because we did these overlay sites and it changed the density on those sites, we were required to, because of Measure M, to get Measure Y out to the voters, and the voters approved Measure Y in June of 2022, which allowed us to put the overlay sites on various sites throughout the city. And during that time, HCD was reviewing our housing element for compliance, and we had to come back in 2023, make some recommended amendments from HCD. They did quite a bit of review and required us to do some amendments. And then following that, in April of 23, we came back with the overlay district ordinance that created all the regulations, all the standards, all the objective standards that go along with that. We had to do the modifications to the zoning map and all the specific plans to place those sites on the various sites that are identified through Measure Y. HCD reviewed those documents, reviews the latest version of the housing element. They also looked at our overlay ordinance for compliance with state law. And as you know, they had some issues with our state law, our ordinance not having all of the elements that needed to be in that document, including related to the requirement for the 100% residential on all of the mixed-use sites, requiring the by right information needed to be in there. So we brought this back to the council in February of this year, and the council had some concerns about needing to make those modifications. And we're caught a little off guard, I believe, about some of those requirements in state law. So we had asked us to kind of reach out to HCD along with the ad hoc committee to try to see if there was any alternatives, anything else we could do. So that's kind of got to us to this point. And I think the Nick's going to kind of go forward with the next. But I do want to tell you, kind of our goal tonight is to get direction from the council to hopefully bring this back as amended, as amended in the ordinance, and as the housing element has been amended. There's no action being taken tonight other than council providing direction on how to move forward. So with that, I'm going to kick it off over to Nick, and he can kind of go through the little bit more in background information on the housing element.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good evening, Mayor, members of City Council. It's good to see you all again. As Mike mentioned, I'm going to walk through a little bit of the history and the contents of the housing element, not too detailed, but enough to be able to provide context for tonight's discussion. As part of, well, maybe we'll have to click. So as part of the housing element, there we go. The housing element document itself contains a sites inventory. These are the sites that the city identified as having potential to redevelop for housing, to meet the city's overall regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA as we often call it. As you can see, the sites identified potential housing units for the low, very low categories, moderate, and above moderate. So there are multiple categories within RHNA, but a lot of the focus does go on the low and very low, as that's the most difficult to develop. There are a couple strategies when we go through, and when we first talked about this, it might give a history of the process we walked through. When we first had this discussion, we walked through identifying fewer sites and putting a higher assumption of affordability, but then creating a larger buffer to make sure that the city was covered in case, as we walk through in a couple slides, some of the sites didn't redevelop as we anticipated, or identifying more sites and having a lower percentage identified. The city made the decision, city council made the decision that that was going to result in the identification of far too many sites, and so we went with a lower number, larger number of affordable, but then increasing the buffer, as HCD does recommend a buffer, so you don't get in a no net loss situation and put yourselves back in having to identify additional sites. So you can see here's just a snippet from that. The city does have a surplus buffer of about 1,500 sites in the housing element right now. As we go through, I mentioned the city essentially creating that buffer as a way to accommodate sites not developing the way we had anticipated or the way that the housing element allocates units. You can see there's an example before Planning Commission already for some of the sites identified in the housing element, and that would bring the city's buffer down potentially 204 units once that project is finalized. So that's just an example of how the city has to go back and essentially true up those numbers to make sure that the city still has enough identified capacity to accommodate the remaining units. Two examples here. Important to note, these are both currently on vacant sites, as those are the easiest to redevelop, least barriers, and again, all sites identified in the housing element by state law need to be ones that have the potential to redevelop, but vacant sites very much so are the most likely to. But these two sites alone, again, if the projects were to go through as proposed or as approved, would drop the city's buffer to around 1,100 units. So you can see that it's important to keep and maintain a good-sized buffer so the city is not coming back into a situation where we're having to identify additional sites. So what happens if the buffer runs out? HCD, the State Department of Housing and Community Development, has in state law that you have 180 days to essentially rezone additional sites or come up with additional capacity. For Chino, that's really tough because of Measure M and the need to have that be part of the process of identifying and then adding capacity on those additional sites. We'll go a little bit more into that when we talk about the discussion we had with HCD and some of the options that we explored through those discussions. But consequently, staff would not recommend removing any sites from the inventory until new sites have been identified. Again, that process is a timely one that we'll cover at the sort of the end of this presentation, and it does run past that 180-day timeline typically. So, as Mike mentioned in one of his bullet points, an ad hoc committee was formed since the last meeting, met twice with Paul McDougall, who is the senior reviewer for HCD. He's one of them. He's the one assigned to Chino's housing element, and discussed the concerns around the fully affordable requirement. That requirement not being that they have to be fully residential, but that the overlay allow that sites could be fully residential. And so there were a couple other mixed use issues relating to the mixed use or concerns relating to the mixed use overlay as well that were discussed with Paul, but that was the primary one. HCD committed to exploring alternative paths and meeting again with the city to discuss those. Some of those paths, they all sort of centered around how could we put additional sites or additional potential capacity in the affordable housing overlay, which is on residential sites, versus the mixed-use overlay. You can see they're listed here, designating additional non-commercial sites to the affordable housing overlay, increasing the density on existing affordable housing overlay sites, or alternatively removing some of the sites from the mixed-use overlay. And so HCD worked through all of those potential options with the ad hoc committee. Upon that further discussion, staff also provided language related to Measure M and also Measure Y, which implemented the overlay districts as outlined in the housing element. So HCD had full context of what those measures included and some of the restrictions that they placed on potentially identifying sites that were not in the housing element or modifying the housing element to include additional sites. HCD determined that due to limitations of Measure Y and Measure M, that options, those proposed options that we discussed on the previous slide were not feasible. Ultimately, they confirmed that the ordinance would need to be adopted in the format presented at the previous hearing, essentially because of the constraints of state law and the requirements of state law. So a little bit on the overlay requirements. There are other overlay requirements. I think they're in the staff report, but these were the two that, based on the last meeting, were causing the most concern for how they were laid out. These are all directly from state requirements, directly from state law. And so the first one to go into is the discussion of buy right. If units, if a project proposes 20% of units to be affordable in the low or very low income categories, and they meet some other criteria as well. For non-vacant sites, it's having to be identified in a previous housing element period, and for vacant sites, it's in 2 or more previous housing element periods. And the city does have a few sites that fall into those categories, though certainly not all of them. Also, on a site that allows mixed use, so the mixed use overlay sites would qualify for that. They must allow the potential to have 100% residential use. It does not mean that the site would redevelop for 100% residential or has to redevelop for 100% residential. The intent is to have a mixed use site, but it includes that language. It also says the city must require residential to occupy at least 50% of the floor area in a mixed use project. So these are two, again, requirements from state law relating to mixed use sites. So now I'll pass it back over to Mike to go over some of the shopping centers and overlays.
Yes. So if you remember, there was some discussion about, I think the biggest concern was the requirement that the overlay sites that are a mixed use would completely cover shopping centers. And we had this map kind of put together that kind of showed, I kind of split it in two so it's easy to see. The purple kind of shows where the shopping centers are, and then the hatched areas kind of show where the overlay sites are located. And the same on the kind of the south end here. But there was the primary concern were kind of these kind of commercial core. So right around Philadelphia and between Central and Benson, that's where you have Target, you have Planet Fitness. And as you can see, only about less than half that site is kind of covered with the overlay. Kind of the western half that tends to be a little less occupied. And then to the north, that's kind of the little shopping center up there with the movie theater. You can see the not all of it is completely covered by the overlay district. And the same with off of Walnut and Central. The north half is kind of the Ben Franklin Center. That portion is where overlays, where residential could go, with the Walgreens and the buildings on the corner not covered by that. And the same with the south side. There's some areas that would remain commercial, where the coverage would be cover the rest of it. And again, I think it's important to note that, as you saw earlier, there was only 2 sites that are sort of one's entitled, one's in process. To date, since we've had this ordinance adopted, I have yet to have spoken to anyone with a real application coming in looking at any commercial centers. It's only been the mostly vacant land that they've been looking at, I think, because that's kind of the easier, more the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And then here's a couple other samples. This is the market there on the north side of Riverside between Benson and Oaks, and that's the former JCPenney building that we have in there too, because it's quite a big parking area and the building's not being utilized. So I just want to kind of give you some examples of where there were some concerns, but those sites are not 100% covered. You do have those maps in front of you too. And then, so based upon what we've kind of presented tonight, and I was going to kick it over to Fred, but I can kind of go over it as well, is based on our conversation with HCD and our conversation with the ad hoc committee, staff recommends that the city council move on the ordinance that was presented to you previously for consideration of adoption. And if the housing element is not adopted, the city will continue to face a number of potential impacts to non-compliant status. So what we're kind of going to get into with Fred was, and we've already had some issues, we lost some grant funding because we didn't have a certified housing element. We lost 2 housing grants. There's the builder's remedy. The builder's remedy basically says if you don't have a certified housing element, a developer could come in and go to almost anywhere in the city and propose a project. And because we don't have a certified housing element, we would have to work through that process. No one has done that as of yet. We are in what we call substantial compliance. That's maybe been able, with HCDs, that's maybe to be able to hold that at bay, but doesn't mean that couldn't happen in the future. And the courts could compel the city to make amendments to the housing element if a lawsuit is brought against the city. There's several lawsuits that have been either placed from the state to cities, from what we call YIMBY groups to cities, and developers have sued cities. So, and I can show you, there's some examples that Fred had put up here in a minute. And then there's most recently this SB 1037, I believe it goes into effect in January, was just recently signed into law, where cities can be fined, I believe it's $50,000 a month if we don't have a certified housing element. There's some nuance in there, I'm sure, but there'd have to be a process to go through that. But that's a more recent law that just recently was signed.
Mike,
Yeah.
Mark has a question.
So Mike, obviously I know that you guys took these numbers and you went to the state and the state said this, and you want us to adopt what we had previously had problems with. Why isn't the new Stark facility listed as a potential area for housing and giving us the opportunity to look at that and potentially take off some sites? Because like he said, there's some reason because we don't have the large land. This isn't something that falls under Measure M because it wasn't incorporated in the city at the time of Measure M, so we wouldn't even have to worry about Measure M. But we have 140 acres that the governor just signed and said that we could build or we could take over, that we could potentially utilize for housing. Why aren't we looking at that? I know it's a last minute thing, but you're asking us to vote on an item that locks us in for 10 years when we've already had an agreement that we could take possession of this for a week. Why isn't this included in here so that we could look at a more updated thing and we could potentially look at something and say, okay, well, since we've added this many potential sites here in the Stark property, now some of those controversial shopping centers that we initially had issues with, maybe we could take those off, as opposed to locking us into something for 10 years and not even utilizing 140 acres that's just been agreed upon by the state of California to be able to turn over to the city to develop.
There's other plans for that.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I mean,
Well,
we could utilize some of that. Since we're going to utilize housing, why aren't we identifying that now?
well, the short answer is that at the time, it wasn't available when we were going through and identifying the sites. There is one site north of there that had previously been discussed where we did identify some potential sites. I put up there on that map. It's at 147. I believe we identified 10 acres at the time. The Stark facility wasn't something that was on our table as being able to be added. That doesn't mean if we do development there and there is affordable sites, that we can still count those affordable units in our RENA calculation. That can be done. There's also a little uncertainty on how, when you surplus land, if there's a requirement to do a certain amount of affordable units between the state and how that works. We'd have to work through that. But in order to change the land use to allow for residential, we would still have to go through Measure M, because this is in the city at the time when Measure M was adopted in 1988, which would delay, if we did that and we took sites out and we added this site, it would delay getting the housing element certified.
Why would we have to go, if we didn't have to go through Measure M for College Park? Or
We did go through Measure M for College Park.
We did.
College-
What if it didn't pass, though?
Then you're back at the same vote, same
It's just
position.
up to the voters.
It's up to the
And
voters,
if
right?
they don't agree with it, then we're back to square one.
Correct.
He sues us.
Correct. Yeah, the point is it would still delay getting the housing element certified because we're doing this, taking sites out, trying to get this passed. It could take, I'm not even sure to get on the ballot, it could take a year. So that puts us at risk of the builder's remedy and all these other, and the fines and the other things that go along with that.
Okay.
And to go back, I don't know, Fred, he was going to maybe go into this, but there's just a few, there's case examples of these groups. La Cañada Frentilage was, I believe, had some issues. Pasadena, there's this California homeownership versus Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills, as you probably know, had a lot of issues. Fred wasn't really going to get too deep into these, but just he had examples of several, that's probably Fred right there, several lawsuits that had gone through this kind of process, and they've basically pretty much every lawsuit that's been presented, the cities have lost.
And Mike, real quick, you had mentioned that some cities are realizing fines of $50,000.
There's a new state law
For that?
that I believe goes into effect in January that was signed by the governor that cities would get fined up to $50,000 a month, I believe it is, for not having a certified housing element.
And he did sign that?
Yes.
The fines start at 10,000, but can go up to 50,000. That's correct.
Yeah, Mike, I have a question. So let's just say this is approved, right, and we're good to go 3 years down the line. Can this housing element be amended, before?
Yes, we can amend it any time. And then, you're thinking, so 3 years from now, you're getting into
Year five?
27, 20, so it's getting towards the end. So we'll start a new cycle starting in 2030.
But this can be amended, though.
It could be amended, yes. And I think as we, slowly see sites come off, we may have to look at that because we may have to look at adding sites as the buffer goes down.
So, for example, the Stark property that, Councilmember
Yes.
Lucio was talking about, if this goes through and that's something we want to consider, we go through, right, through the measure, we get the vote, right, we send that to the
Yes.
voters. It would have to be passed by the voters before we...
Make the amendments, yeah. That was actually the recommendation of HCD, was get your housing element certified, adopt the ordinance as required, and then if you want to come back and take sites out or look at other sites, we can go through that process.
And Mike, the Measure M vote would be specific to the area that we're looking at, correct?
Right, it'd just be for those, whatever APNs, whatever addresses we put in, whatever areas we put in, it'd be just very specific to those, just like this one was very specific to these specific parcels, not like necessarily kind of a global area. You have to identify parcels of land.
And also, if I may add, you could certainly do a Measure M that includes several parcels. So if the Stark property is one property, you can consider, as the council thinks through this housing element, you could select other sites to consider, and the Measure M would potentially include several sites in the city. The one twist is HCD then has to approve any amendment to the housing element, should you wish to pursue that. So it's a little bit of a process, but certainly within your right to do.
If I could just add really quickly, as you go through that process, it's easier when you have a compliant housing element to work through that process than when you're in a position where you don't have one.
So, Mike, I was part of this back and forth with HCD and Paul, and I go back to, it seems almost impossible to keep the city buffer from running out without partnering with legitimate, affordable, or low-income housing developers. So, because each time we do the overlay or designate these locations, what's happening with the present laws, I think, is important to state, is that current developers, for example, the one that you had approved down off of Chino Hills Parkway in Ramona, are coming in and developing at market value with this percentage, right, of affordable housing. The issue that has to be explained to people looking at this, not just in this workshop, but in the public meeting, is that if we go down this path with the overlay or the affordable housing designations, if they're all developed at market value with just the percentage, we never, in perpetuity, never get to meet our arena number. And that's the rub with everybody sitting up here in every city. It becomes impossible to ever hit or make the number, which is why everybody is so conflicted about putting an element into place where we know from the get-go, cannot be accomplished. What the public needs to know is we keep being told by law and by HCD, hey, you just have to have a housing element that's adopted that allows for and identifies these locations with these numbers in place. But the problem with that is it allows what I consider not well-intended developers who want to come in and develop at market rate with these percentages to work around growth measures or the zoning that we intended in these locations. So I think that's clearly what has to be stated in the public meeting and for people to understand. While we all desire to have a compliant housing element, we're all as cities passing housing elements that we know aren't really realistically attainable. So I guess my question is, how do we partner with legitimate affordable housing people like CORE or other places in order to bring true, like if we were going to develop 200 housing units that are all truly, all 200 of them affordable, not like ones that we've passed where, okay, we're developing 250 units here and 230 of them are going to be market value, and City of Chino, you should be happy that 20 of them are, in the percentage of affordable.
If I may address that, once redevelopment was taken away from us, our ability to really control the game has changed, right? We don't have the funding. I actually just came from the meeting at the Housing Authority of San Bernardino County. My apologies for being late. They had the longest meeting in history. And we're doing a deal with CORE, National CORE. The amount of just efforts we have to do to get that funded, there's tax credit work that the developer's doing to gain a chunk of the money, but that's not enough to develop low-income housing. The Housing Authority has to put its funding into the project. So the ultimate conclusion is that we don't have those tools and most importantly, the funding to do it. So that actually somewhat segues into this slide before you, because I think there's a disconnect between the Housing Accountability Act that allows developers to come in and force cities to approve projects like they did along Ramona that you mentioned, without requiring affordability into a level that will match what is being required in your green allocation. And you're absolutely right, Mayor Pro Tem. And maybe we don't need HCD to hear this, but they know most cities don't meet their RENA allocation. And if they do, they're not meeting all the affordability levels of that RENA allocation. So here's a perfect example. The case before you, if I may pivot to that. Here's a developer that proposed a certain project in the city of Berkeley. The city denied it. It was a mixed-use development, so it wasn't majority affordable. The city got sued for denying it, and they were hit with a pretty significant judgment, as the bottom line shows, with a $2.6 million judgment for alleged lost profits. So there isn't that state coordination between the RENA mandate and all of this Housing Accountability Act requirements and rights that developers have to sort of force these developments onto cities. If I may move on, the next case, this is one that has really created a lot of law in this area, because here is one where the city of Clovis was sued for not having a compliant housing element. And so as a result of the lawsuit, the resident Martinez essentially was able to secure this leverage and force the parties to enter into a settlement agreement that required changes to the zoning law, establishment of a funding contribution of $1.8 million towards a housing trust fund. So there are all of these repercussions to not having your approved housing element. And the settlement agreement that was entered into was done in the face of the city potentially facing bigger liability. This one entity, the California for Home Ownership, has been suing several jurisdictions, one of which was Beverly Hills, and the lawsuit alleged that they did not have a compliant housing element. The trial court ruled in favor of California for Home Ownership, and the city was ordered to bring its zoning code and its housing element in compliance, and suspended the city's permitting power until they did so. All of their permitting power, not just as to this project, but any authority to approve. So if a developer wanted to build some commercial facility in the city of Beverly Hills or whatnot, it was suspended until they did this.
But I would also say, like, in the fine print, it's on pause, right? Pending the appeal, so they're still issuing.
Right. What we're finding, though, is cities are not successful in challenging these lawsuits when they don't have compliant housing elements. There's sort of example after example. I don't necessarily need to go through all of them, but I provided them for your reference that in this particular case, the city of Davis was forced to approve a project because they didn't have a compliant housing element under what we've talked about called the builder's remedy, which essentially allows a developer to force a development that may not comply with your standards, but unless you have a housing element, you can't enforce those standards. So that's what the new law essentially provides. Here's another one where another nonprofit sued La Cañada Flint Ridge. It happens to be one of our clients, and it was a pretty hard-fought battle. Ultimately, the city wanted to push back, but the judge ultimately ruled in favor of the nonprofit and the applicant. There are several other examples we provided where as Californians for Home Ownership just seems to be pursuing cities for failing to adopt the updated housing elements, and some of these cases have not been completed, but in the one against Manhattan Beach and Beverly Hills, as I mentioned earlier, the Superior Court agreed with the plaintiffs and found that they hadn't complied. So it not only do they have these tough requirements, the repercussions are pretty severe, and there's no funding to really meet your RHNA requirements, especially on the affordability level. What all the council is really doing is allowing for development, but that's not to say the development actually comes.
Sid, Fred, I have a question. These cases you brought up, these were all LA County, is that right?
They're different throughout the state.
Are there any?
I think we have some that are,
jurisdiction?
Clovis is not LA County, neither is City of Davis, obviously. But many are. They just essentially target cities that have been late. Most cities have adopted their, I don't know if we actually have the number of how many have, but.
Yeah, actually, so far for the SCAG region, there's 197 agencies, and 80% have adopted their housing elements. In San Bernardino County, there's 25 agencies and 9 have not, so about 64%. But look like they're all still working through the process to get them adopted. The interesting thing too, there's even more recently, I've seen some what we call YIMBY groups, Yes in My Backyard groups, that actually have websites that list all the cities that don't have certified housing elements, almost like saying here's who doesn't have one and here's why. So it's all that's out there in the ether as far as identifying the agencies that aren't in compliance. So take that for what it's worth.
I have a question. How often is the by right ability being utilized?
know, maybe.
In Chino specifically or
Just
throughout?
in general.
It's still, in terms of applications coming through, it's not super early, but it's still a little bit early. I personally haven't seen a lot come through. I'm working on a project that's doing a fully affordable housing project in San Jose, but that's not using the buy right. That's using some of the separate funding that Fred talked about. I don't have any statistics on how many are using the buy right, the 20% buy right requirement.
And I think that'd be pretty rare here because we didn't do the overlays with the last housing element that was done this time. So I don't know the exact number, but not that many of the sites were in the previous housing elements. And that's one of the requirements of the buy right. It has to have been within a previous housing element and wasn't developed.
The reason why I'm asking is you hear the developers whine and cry all the time that they can't afford to build affordable units, right? Well, the buy right requiring, what is it, 25% affordable?
20%.
20%, yeah.
Okay, 20% affordable. Obviously, we don't have the funding to help them with that, so they would be burdened with the full cost. Seems like if it really is true they can't afford it, seems like they wouldn't be using it that much.
I'll just add, it varies in different markets, depending on what the land costs are and different factors. But I know that there was a city, I believe it was Costa Mesa, who did a study on what their requirement should be for their inclusionary ordinance, and the percentage came out to like 12 or 13% or something in that range, because higher than that was likely to cause developers not to be able to afford to build.
Yeah, and if you remember, we had to make some adjustments to our range because of the affordability based on diff fees and cost of construction and everything else. So we had to change the range from 9 to 13%. I believe it previously was 10 to 20. So that percentage came down because of the affordability being so costly. And there's even some other state laws, AB 2011, which I believe you can pretty much go on any commercial site, but you have to do 15%, you have to do prevailing wage. So there hasn't been developers really doing that for the very reason you stated. It's very costly and doesn't really pencil out. So these, take it for what it's worth, these kind of lower requirements for affordability on mostly vacant land pencils a little bit better, but they have to do the market rate housing for the balance in order for it to make it work.
You know, one thing that just frustrates me is we did the mixed use, thinking it was truly going to be mixed use. You'd have commercial with housing. Housing would support the commercial, you know, it would be a nice mix. And for them to allow 100% housing on mixed use is ridiculous. I mean, mixed use should be mixed use, not all housing. How in the world did they interpret mixed use to be all housing?
Good question.
That seems like it should be challenged.
Yeah.
I mean, they want low and moderate income near shopping centers and on transportation lines and stuff. A true mixed use supports lower income being near shopping opportunities, not 100% housing.
I would agree with you.
The state's driving us nuts.
And I guess kind of lastly, we talked a little bit about the timing, kind of related to the start piece that Councilman Lucio had mentioned, and maybe Nick can kind of chime in on some of the timing.
I think we've sort of indirectly talked through some of this already, but making amendments to the housing element would require us to notice with tribal consultation. We have the time period, however long that was, to go through and make the revisions to the housing element. We would have the community meeting outreach, noticing requirements that the state has for making revisions to the document. We would then have HCD's review period, which is 60 days. It can vary, assuming it only went one more cycle of review, and that's largely dependent on on the severity of the changes that got made. There'd be additional public review, consultation, and then obviously going back to hearings in Planning Commission, City Council before final approval by HCD. So it's a drawn-out process that would likely take the better part of a year, I'm going to guess.
And this doesn't take into account if we wanted to add sites that we would likely have to do Measure M.
Yeah.
So if we adopted this to avoid any kind of legal challenges by this Californians for home ownership, which I think is ridiculous, it seems to me that their time would be better spent challenging these mega businesses that are buying up housing like crazy to make them rental units and stuff. But to avoid a lawsuit from them or another group, adopting the housing element would be the wise thing to do, and then immediately start studying to see if there's anything that we can change.
I would just suspect that they're going for the low-hanging fruit. They know these laws are favored on their side, and that's why they pursue them.
Making a lot of money on them. It's like ambulance chasers.
Lawyers.
Lawyer, I know. You people.
They people, not us.
Oh, those people. Other council comments, questions? Kurt?
I would just like to say that I think that we as a council have gone above and beyond at this point in time, and as far as looking into all the alternatives, sending staff back, getting additional information. I feel like we have done a lot at this point in time as a council to try to resolve this issue without being bullied by the state of California. At this point in time, I appreciate the staff and what they've done, and also our city council for going through reams and reams of paper trying to resolve the issue or come up with the alternatives. I just want everybody to know how much I appreciate the time we put into it.
Well, the frustrating thing too is that the general population obviously doesn't understand.
Right.
And a lot of these zoning requirements now are going to create a lot of nightmares for us in the future. You can't require parking. And of course, when you build this kind of density, developers don't want to build a parking structure. And when you have 2 and 3 bedroom units, they'll give 1 parking space, maybe 1.5. It's not enough. So our neighborhoods are going to be impacted by this, as our shopping centers, because I'm sure any of these dense developments that go in near a shopping center, people are going to park over there.
And for me, again, now that the governor has signed this new law into place where he can charge cities $50,000 a month, it's just, for us, that's just not being reasonable and rational and responsible to our citizens of our community if we put this off. So we're going to have to figure this out right away.
Karen?
Yeah, if I may, I think the only goal would be from council would be, we're looking at, the next, trying to get it done before the end of the year, to bring it back as a public hearing. We just have to notice it, just like we re-notice it like we did last time. The commission's already chimed in, so now it just has to go with the council. So we can probably do that as soon as maybe the second meeting in November, or if there's a time that works better for you, let us know. But we'd like to get direction on when to bring it back, if that's where the council would like to go tonight.
I don't think we have an alternative, to be perfectly honest with you. Karen?
Yeah, I think I remain conflicted about the element, but that's, obviously more of a discussion for the public meeting and council. There's 2 options here, the way I see it. For council in the appropriate noticed meeting to vote to adopt the housing element, right? If we vote to adopt the housing element, then what I would tell staff is it's incumbent upon you and you, Chris, to start working with bona fide builders that want to advance true properly managed affordable housing. And they're out there. And Fred, we have affordable housing developments in town, not that many. But the reason that they are good projects is because they're well managed and they're out there. And I think it's important for the public to understand that there are good affordable housing projects out there and in our surrounding communities where they will apply for these monies, Fred. Once they identify the site, they're going to identify the site, and they know these rubrics because this is what they do based off of the scores that come out annually or biannually by the state. It's been explained to us. And they will seek to construct those projects once they are fully funded. And then that's when it's fully funded, that's when it becomes a true, low income or properly managed affordable housing sites with the wraparound services there that are well maintained and welcomed additions to a community. What becomes difficult is the workaround by the for-profit industry who is developing for-profit under the guise, because it's truly under the guise of our growth measures and the laws that have been adopted by the state, with these nominal amounts of affordability into them. And really, it becomes questionable how they remain affordable into the future, quite frankly, that I think are complete workarounds. So if we want to actually develop some well-managed affordable housing in our community, which I think should be the goal of every community, from high-end housing and estate properties to inclusive housing in our community, our staff has work to get done with a properly adopted element to work with places that can do that. They're out there and they know how to do it, and we better get our minds around it.
And
I
if,
hope you're right. My only hesitancy is I know Bridge Housing was extremely successful, and I think we put something like $5 million into that project to make a pencil, and we don't have that kind of money to contribute.
Oh, I agree with you, Mary. Like National Core and those companies, they've committed, once they identify a site, that they will work with the city and the state and other entities, and more importantly, the federal funding to bring those, until they're fully funded. And they said from the time that the site is identified until the time that they construct it, normally takes between 2 to 3 years. And they're doing business all over Orange County, in San Diego County, in Texas, and I want to say in Florida. So there are companies out there that do it and manage it well and bring in those services, and you wouldn't recognize them as any different than one of our higher density units, but that's who we have to partner with if we are going to bring some of that, affordability, well-managed affordability into our community.
We don't want to create 20 years from now a slum.
No, we don't, and the high-density housing has been properly managed through crime-free multi-housing, or you can look at, we have a, I want to say a 53 or 58 unit housing authority complex in town, or other ones that are heavily subsidized. And most members in our community wouldn't know that. I know that because of my professional background. But those are all very well managed. What I'm saying is, before we turn our nose up to them, like the one that we just visited, I heard a testimonial from a female Marine Corps veteran. There's not the people living in some of these sites any longer that they have the stigma of living in them. You have, as Mark, when he visited, was a retired teacher who just can't afford some of the housing because of the market rate in California and the prices that they're paying for these. I don't know that I would consider them still truly affordable. They're still very expensive to live in. So,
Mayor, on the bridge housing, we gave them 10 million, but they also got the land for free. So another thing that, as you all know, we signed on with the SBCOG, and part of that's going to be the housing trust. So hopefully down the line there'll be enough money in there that can help with some of what you're talking about today.
Well, I think to avoid, and I do not like our housing element. I don't like what we've had to do. But I think if we don't adopt this element, I think we're going to probably be flying a red flag in front of the bull that wants to sue us. And I think we can avoid that by doing this and then immediately start working, like on the suggestion that you're saying, Karen, and maybe looking at some other sites.
and if I may add, some of the efforts that we've done, myself working with your staff, is to impose these low-income housing development requirements when we have a larger development agreement. There is a fee that Lewis pays that is documented in the development agreement. When Fallon Crest came forward, we imposed a requirement that they had to produce and record covenants against a site on their property for affordable housing, and that they partner up with that developer. So when it's a larger project, it's easier to push a developer to do that because they can offset the costs.
I have a question about that, Fred. When there's a restriction on a property that has to stay low income, who follows up on that to ensure that if that unit sells or is rented again, that it stays low income?
So typically, if it's a condition of approval that the city imposes, then the city would do it. The agreement that is recorded would clarify that. The city reports to HCD units that it counts towards its affordability. So they're responsive to HCD as well.
But do we really follow up and check on that? Like, for instance, if it was a home that's sold as low income, if it sells again, do we really get involved in the sale of that property to ensure that it went to low income? Or is it just incumbent upon the property seller or the real estate company to do it?
I am working with your housing staff, as Chris knows very well. The benefit is when it's actually recorded against title, they can't just sell it off to someone at a market rate. The sale price has to be reflective of what is authorized as low income, and the covenants go on in time. So,
What about
sorry.
rentals?
So he's exactly right about the ownership, because we have a deed of trust protecting our interest, which is the affordability covenants. We're notified the minute the property is it can't go into escrow even without us being willing to sign off, and we only sign off if all the covenants are met, which means it's turned over at an affordable price. And that's what's happened at D.R. Horton and other places like that, where we've done first-time home buyers and affordable ownership housing. For rentals, in the past, we were pretty good about doing annual audits of all of the rental housing. So we have 10 units at Villa del Sol. We have the Seasons Senior Villas. We have Ivy. We have Meadow Square. Doing audits to make sure that they're charging the correct rents, to make sure that they're doing the proper income verifications for the tenants, and to also just kind of do a site inspection to make sure that they're meeting the property maintenance requirements that we put into our covenants. That's something that's fallen a little bit off in the last few years, and we're going to pick that back up. So it is something, though, that will be done annually at a minimum. I think that one of the things we're going to have to explore, and this is kind of a new problem, is it's one thing when you had a handful of projects, but as Mayor Pro Tem, has kind of forecasted, if we do see these developers coming in, building these projects with these small-scale numbers of affordable units, and we start to have a litany of projects throughout the city, one of the scary things, there's two things about that concern me. Number one, these for-profit developers are not your bridge housing types that do, or the management firm at the Seasons, that this is what they do. This is now kind of a side show to them, right, in their business. It's not something they historically have. So number one, for them to be successful, I think we're going to have to provide some technical assistance as to how it's done. Number two, we're going to have to audit more and more properties. So it's something that I think we need to consider a variety of things, from possibly fees on these developers on an annual basis to cover our audit costs, our ability for our staff to go out there and do the necessary audits to make sure that they remain in compliance.
And are you looking at that now?
Yes.
Well, Chris, that's my question. I think it would be prudent for us to take an audit of what we consider rental affordability at this point, as well as housing stock affordability by title, by deed, right? That we're making sure of that, and get an accurate number of what that is for us, right? So we have, I guess, a benchmark of where we're at.
Yep.
And where we're headed. I think it is, to the mayor's point, a little different than, we're not going to see many more houses develop where, back in the 90s we had inclusionary housing, right? I was actually the benefactor of an inclusionary home as a first-time home buyer, where that then becomes that, the benefit to that homeowner. When I sold it at fair market value. But what you're talking about, the true affordability in the title, has to remain in the title so we can secure it moving forward.
It does, and both on the ownership
And audit it
and
the
rentals.
proper way.
Yeah, both on the ownership and the rental side. It's got to meet state requirements. State requirements are 55 years for rental housing, 45 years for ownership housing.
And I'm sure we're behind on doing that,
Oh, yeah.
tracking it appropriately. Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments? Okay, if there's no objection, then we will ask you to come back with the appropriate recommendation so that we can move forward and get this horrible thing adopted.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
All right, are there any comments from the audience? Okay, seeing none, then we will adjourn to our next regular meeting, which will be held on October 15th at 6 o'clock, with closed session starting no earlier than 4 o'clock if needed.